Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in World War II, the man who planned the D-Day invasion, a 5-star general, one of the most celebrated military minds in the history of the United States. Now that man became president, and then allegedly he sat down at a table with alien beings from another world and signed a contract with them. A contract with aliens on behalf of all of humanity. And nobody voted for it, nobody was consulted, the American people were not informed, he just did it. So it's February in 1954, and President Eisenhower is on vacation in Palm Springs, California. Now, one Saturday evening, Eisenhower seemingly disappeared, and rumors began circulating that he had died from a heart attack. The White House press secretary had to hold an emergency press conference to stop the death rumors, and the official explanation they gave was that the president had chipped a tooth on a chicken wing at dinner and had to make an emergency trip to a local dentist, which is a pretty good story, wouldn't you say? Here's the thing though, there are no records at the Eisenhower Library, which reportedly has extensive records related to Eisenhower's health, that he ever underwent dental surgery in February of 1954. The library has his dental records, and the dental records don't have this visit. It's just not there. So that leaves the question, where the hell was he? Well, the theory says that he was at Edwards Air Force Base, and what was waiting for him there was extraterrestrials. Now this is where it kind of gets a little interesting, because according to the conspiracy theory, this wasn't the first attempt. The first meeting is believed to have been with the Nordic aliens, which are an advanced extraterrestrial race described as having fair hair, blue eyes, and white skin. And apparently, they offered advanced technology and spiritual enlightenment in exchange for the United States agreeing to dismantle all of their nuclear weapons. Eisenhower said no, of course, because, he was not going to give up the nukes, so the Nordics left without a deal. But then a second group showed up, the Gray aliens, and the Greys made a very different kind of offer. Now, the terms of the treaty with the Greys were reportedly as follows. We could not be involved in their affairs, and they would not be involved in ours. So that means, they could abduct humans for various experiments, but they had to provide names of all of those that they abducted to a special committee. And the public would not be informed about the existence of extraterrestrials. So allegedly, Eisenhower looked at those terms, which include allowing alien beings to experiment on American citizens, and said, you know what, sure, deal, shake my hand. We'll let you do that in exchange for technology. And then apparently we used that technology and then began to build things in secret, without telling anybody. I mean, now look, the guy who is most cited as the original source for this story is a man named Gerald Light, who wrote a letter in April 1954 claiming that he personally witnessed the meeting at Edwards Air Force Base. So that's pretty much all the evidence we have for this theory. It's literally just one letter from one guy that, nobody can verify. So of course, the skeptic in me and the skeptic in you guys should be like, all right, this is definitely not real. I mean, we can all agree that it sounds pretty crazy that the, president of the United States met with extraterrestrials and made a deal with them. But there's one part that gets me a little riled up here. So 7 years after this alleged treaty was signed, Eisenhower walked out of the White House for the last time. He got on national television and he delivered what is now one of the most famous farewell speeches in American history. And now you're probably wondering, what did he warn us about? Well, he warned the American people to guard against the acquisition of unwanted influence by the military-industrial complex, saying that the potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. Now, keep in mind that this is a 5-star general, the supreme, allied commander of World War II, one of the most powerful military men who has, ever lived. And his last act as president was to go on TV and warn everyone about the secret unholy alliance between the military and industry that was operating beyond public accountability. It's kind of like, why do that? Why would the man who ran that military complex spend his final moments in office warning us about it? It's kind of like, what did he know? What did he see? What did he agree to? and all of this stuff, something had to haunt him enough to stand in front of the whole country on his way out of, the Oval Office and say, hey, watch these people. They have too much power and nobody is watching them. So it's, your job to watch them, blah, 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 whatever. So did Dwight Eisenhower secretly negotiate a treaty with alien beings? I mean, sell out humanity's right to not be experimentally probed and then spend the rest of his life quietly regretting it? I mean, probably not, but also, who knows? I mean, that farewell speech, though, it's a little weird in my opinion. That's all I'll say about that. So let me paint you guys a little picture. So it's 12,000 years ago. You are a hunter-gatherer. You don't have a horse. You don't have a farm. You don't have a city or a government or a wheel or metal tools or writing or poetry. I mean, you are, by every definition that modern historians have ever used, a primitive nomad wandering the landscape looking for food. That's what you are supposed to be doing 12,000 years ago, That is what the entire established academic timeline of human history says that you were doing. And yet, somehow, you and a few hundred of your fellow primitive nomads decided to get together and build one of the most sophisticated stone temple complexes ever discovered on the face of the earth. And that is, of course, the Gobekli Tepe. Now, the Gobekli Tepe is a Neolithic archaeological site in what is now southeastern Turkey. It contains large circular structures made up of massive T-shaped limestone pillars, among some of the world's oldest known megaliths, many of which are decorated with detailed carvings of wild animals and abstract symbols. Now, Gobekli Tepe was constructed around 7,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids and 6,000 years before Stonehenge. So 7,000 years before the pyramids. I mean, just kind of let that sink in for a second. Now, researchers discovered that hunter-gatherers were responsible for the site, since no domesticated plants or animals have been recovered. No agriculture, no permanent settlements in the area, no cities, no centralized government to organize a massive construction project. It was apparently just people, wandering people with stone tools who somehow, quarried, transported, and precisely erected pillars across multiple circular structures. The largest one standing up to 5.5 meters in height and weighing up to 10 tons, with some estimates for unfinished pillars running even higher than that. So 10 tons, possibly even more, each, moved and stood upright by nomads with rocks. Now, mainstream archaeology, of course, has an explanation for all of this. They say that it demonstrates that humans were more sophisticated than we thought, and that religion and communal ritual may have actually preceded and even inspired agriculture, and that Gobekli Tepe is just a remarkable example of what early humans were capable of, which is like, fine, that's okay, it's a reasonable take, but then there's another take. The ancient alien theory looks at Gobekli Tepe and says, there's just absolutely no way. The geometric position of the site is the first thing that grabs people. Using computer modeling, researchers revealed that workers relied heavily on geometry to construct the monolithic structures, with an equilateral triangle pattern regulating the position of 3 enclosures and their architectural elements, built using 3 T-shaped pillars that align almost perfectly. An equilateral triangle, perfectly aligned, 12,000 years ago, by people who, again, did not have written language, they didn't have formal mathematics, or, any of the tools that we associate with that kind of precision. So the ancient alien crowd looks at that and says that, someone taught these people. Someone showed up and said, here's how geometry works. Here's how you move a 15-ton stone or 10-ton stone, whatever. And here's what you're building, and here's why you're building it. And then, which is even crazier, the builders eventually covered the entire complex themselves. So bands of nomads came together, they set up these massive stone circles, and then they deliberately buried them with rocks, gravel, and rubble, filling in the various enclosures completely. So they built this thing, and then they buried it on purpose. The whole site, hidden under the earth for over 10,000 years, until a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt stumbled across it in 1994. And it's just like, why would you do that? Why would you spend, what must have taken an absolutely enormous amount of human labor building something this sophisticated and then spend more labor covering it back up again? Now, the mainstream answer is that it was some kind of ritual burial, a ceremonial closing of a sacred space, which maybe, but the ancient alien theorists say that it's something else. They say that it was preserved deliberately, that it was hidden, that it was a message in a bottle from whoever or whatever helped build it, and it was sealed in the earth, and it was just waiting for a civilization advanced enough to find it and to understand it. Now, I would like to point out that we have only excavated a tiny fraction of the site, and ground-penetrating radar and geomagnetic surveys have charted where at least 16 other megalith rings remain buried across 22 acres that are still underground, they're still untouched, and they're still kind of like waiting for us, you know? We really don't know what else is down there. We don't know what else they built. We don't know what the carvings mean. We don't know why they buried it. We don't know who organized it or how. To be honest, we really don't know much about it. So did extraterrestrials land on a hilltop in what is now Turkey, 12,000 years ago and teach a group of hunter-gatherers how to build a geometrically precise megalithic temple complex that wouldn't be matched in scale or sophistication for thousands of years? Who knows? I mean, it's kind of crazy to think, but 12,000 years ago, people who weren't supposed to be capable of it built something that still kind of, baffles us today. And then they buried it, and then they walked away, and we have zero clue why. So, could it be the aliens? All right, so you've heard of alien abductions. I've heard of alien abductions. Your grandma probably has, your mom has, your dog has, whatever. We all know what alien abductions are. There's little gray alien guys, there's bright lights, there's missing times, there's, people waking up and feeling something completely different. Alien abductions. We've all heard, at some point an alien abduction story. Now, according to some researchers, alien abductions aren't random. They're not aliens being curious. They're not aliens trying to be little tourists. They are a breeding program, and it has allegedly been running for a very, very long time. Now, it all starts on a September night in 1961. Betty and Barney Hill were driving down an empty, winding road through New Hampshire's White Mountains when a strange light in the sky seemed to follow them. Now, they pulled their car over, and Barney got out of the car with binoculars. He saw behind rows of windows, gray uniformed beings seemed to be looking right at him. Now, he tried to lift his hand to his pistol, but somehow he couldn't. And he had one thought, and that thought was, we are about to be captured. So he ran back to the car. And then they heard this loud rhythmic beeping that was coming from the trunk of their car. And then all of a sudden, the couple started to feel drowsy, and they lost consciousness. Now, when they finally got home at Portsmouth at dawn, they felt dirty. Their watches had stopped working, Barney's shoes were strangely scuffed, Betty's dress was ripped, and there were 2 hours of the drive that neither of them could remember. Now, over 2 years later, under hypnosis, they separately described being walked up a ramp into a metallic craft, being put in different rooms, and subjected to physical examinations. Now, Betty described a needle probe near her navel that she was told was a pregnancy test. And this is considered by most researchers to be the foundational case. Because before the hills, UFO reports were about lights in the sky and strange craft. But after the hills, they were about contact. And the abduction narrative became a genre unto itself. Now, fast forward to the 1970s and the 1980s, an artist and researcher named Bud Hopkins started collecting abduction accounts. And he collected hundreds of them from people who had never met each other, from completely different backgrounds, from all over the United States. And he kept noticing something. So people who had never met from different backgrounds and locations described nearly identical experiences, particularly concerning reproductive procedures. Now, it wasn't just medical exams. It was specifically and consistently reproductive. Things like egg extractions and sperm collection, and most disturbingly, women who had confirmed pregnancies that simply vanished. There was no miscarriage, no medical explanation. Their babies inside of their body were just gone. Then came along Dr. David Jacobs, who was a history professor at Temple University. He was a tenured academic who spent decades doing hypnotic regression sessions with abductees and eventually arrived at a conclusion so alarming that it apparently broke him a little bit. Now, his theory that was laid out in his book, The Threat, is that this is not random experimentation. The alien agenda involves the creation of genetically engineered alien-human hybrids developed through a multi-generational program that produces beings in various stages of increasingly human appearance. So early stage hybrids look obviously alien. They have thin bodies, they have oversized black eyes, they have, really no hair on their body. And then middle stage hybrids look a little bit more human, but they still kind of got that little alien in them. And then apparently the late stage hybrids, they are seen in public and can often pass for human. And the final stage, what Jacob calls human stage hybrids, are on the surface completely indistinguishable from you and me. Now, Dr. David Jacobs wasn't just talking about lab experiments happening aboard spacecraft in the abstract. He was very specific about what he believed was already happening on the ground. According to Jacobs, these human stage hybrids are reportedly driving cars, they are shopping, they are conducting job interviews, all while maintaining alien abilities of mind control and telepathy. So yes, there are these alien hybrids that are driving cars, shopping, they're, going to job interviews, they're working at Starbucks, they're working at McDonald's right now, potentially, according to this theory. Now look, there is zero physical evidence for any of this. No hybrid babies have ever been produced that we know of. No DNA has been verified. The entire body of evidence is testimony, which is thousands of accounts collected under hypnosis, a method that some scientists have repeatedly shown can generate vivid false memories rather than recover real ones. Dr. David Jacobs himself, toward the end of his research career, reportedly told an interviewer that the conclusion he'd arrived at, that hybrids were actively integrating into human society, was so disturbing that he essentially decided just to stop. He said, after learning all of this, I want to sit around and watch television for the rest of my life. I want to be happy. Which, to be honest, it's pretty reasonable. Yeah. Even just taking a step back from aliens real quick, just with everything going on in the world right now and everybody fighting over, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, everybody fighting. It's like, I think most of us normal people just want to sit at home and be left alone and, do what we want to do, Anyways, so is there an alien species that has been quietly harvesting human genetic material for decades, engineering a race of hybrid beings and then gradually seeding them into our society in preparation for something that nobody has been told about? No, but almost certainly probably not. But thousands of people across decades, across continents, before the internet could connect their stories, described the same program, the same procedures, the same beings with the same goal. And again, these were all independently, they were all consistently, and all of these people were very terrified. So I guess, make of that what you will. Now, every single theory that we've talked about in this, video assumes the same basic thing. That, the UFOs, the encounters, the beings, that they come from out there, from space, from another star system somewhere in the cosmos. And they're little guys in a spacecraft who made the very long trip across the galaxy to come check us out. That's the assumption of aliens, that's kind of the general understanding, I guess. But what if that assumption, is completely fundamentally wrong? The ultraterrestrial theory says that the thing that we've been calling aliens didn't come from another planet. They didn't travel light years through space to get here. They were already here, and they have always been here. And we have been interacting with them over and over for in the entire span of human history. We just keep calling them different things depending on, what century we live in. Now, the man most responsible for this idea was a journalist named John Keel. Now, right off the bat, John Keel is a pretty fascinating guy, if I do say so myself. So he was born in 1930 in New York, and he worked as a journalist parachuting into war zones, cults, and circus tents, and eventually became so consumed by the UFO phenomenon that he claimed to have traveled to 20 states and interviewed thousands of witnesses. Now, he went in fully expecting to confirm the standard extraterrestrial hypothesis, little gray beings with spaceships from another planet. But that's not what happened. He abandoned the extraterrestrial hypothesis in 1967 when his own field investigations disclosed an astonishing overlap between psychic phenomena and UFOs. So he went back and started looking at the whole history of strange encounters. Not just the 20th century flying saucer stuff, I mean all of it throughout history. And this is what he found, laid out in his 1970 book called UFOs, Operation Trojan Horse. What he found was a pattern so consistent across centuries that he just couldn't ignore it. Monsters, ghosts, and demons, vampire legends and mystery airships in 1897 and mystery aeroplanes in the 1930s and mystery helicopters and anomalous creature sightings and poltergeist phenomena. Keel looked at all of those and said the same thing. Different costume, same actor. The phenomenon, whatever it was, wears the clothing of whatever era it's appearing in. In medieval Europe, it showed up as fairies and demons. In 1897, it showed up as mysterious airships. In the 1950s, it showed up as flying saucers. And in every single case, it left people confused, frightened, and utterly unable to explain what they'd experienced. Keel called these beings ultraterrestrials. He believed them to be non-human entities that exist in a wavelength of energy which we cannot detect. Not in outer space, but right here, layered on top of our reality in some dimension that we don't have instruments to measure. And crucially, he believed that they were not visiting us, that they were permanent residents, coexisting with humanity since the very beginning. And now Keel wasn't the only person who believed this. Around the same time, a French computer scientist and astronomer named Jacques Vallée, he arrived at almost the same conclusion through a totally different route. Now, in his landmark 1969 book, Passport to Magnolia, Vallée connected modern UFO encounters with centuries of folklore about fairies, elves, and other non-human entities, and suggested that these weren't separate phenomena, but manifestations of the same intelligence interacting with humans across history. And Vallée made a specific argument that I think is, pretty hard to dismiss. He laid out 5 reasons that the extraterrestrial hypothesis doesn't hold up. 1. Unexplained close encounters are far more numerous than required for any physical survey of the Earth. 2. The humanoid body structure of the alleged aliens is not likely to have originated on another planet and is not biologically adapted to space travel. 3. The reported behavior in thousands of abduction reports contradicts the hypothesis of scientific experimentation by an advanced race. 4. The phenomenon extends throughout all of recorded human history. 5. The apparent ability of UFOs to manipulate space and time suggests radically different alternatives. Now, I want to zoom in on that second point because I don't think it gets nearly enough attention as it should, and I really just want you guys to think about it. If beings evolved on a completely different planet under completely different atmospheric conditions, completely different gravity, completely different evolutionary pressures, why do they look like us? Why do they have 2 eyes and 2 arms and they walk upright? The odds of convergent evolution producing a basically humanoid form on a separate planet are, scientifically speaking, essentially 0. But if these things have always been here, if they just evolved alongside us or adjacent to us in some dimension that we can't perceive, suddenly the humanoid thing makes, a whole lot more sense. As Vallée put it himself, what we see here is not an alien invasion. It is a spiritual system that acts on humans and uses humans. Now, every single major religion in human history, every one of them, pretty much on every continent, again, completely independent from each other, have stories about non-human intelligences that interact with people. There's stories of angels and demons and gods and jinn and spirits and little people and, every culture, every era. It's kind of the same story, again, just a different costume. And either all of those billions of people across all of those thousands of years were collectively hallucinating the same thing, or something has been here with us the whole entire time, and we just don't know what it is. Alright, so most alien abduction stories have one thing working against them right out of the gate. And that is that it's usually just one person. It's one person saying that, oh, look what happened to me. I got carried away by a bunch of aliens and they probed my butthole. It's usually just one person. And look, I'm not saying that those people are lying, but one person's word is, one person's word. That's always going to have a ceiling on how serious, people will take it. But the Allagash Waterway abduction has four people on the same night with the same experience. And they didn't even talk about it with each other for over a decade. So in August of 1976, 4 young art students from Boston left for a canoe and camping trip in Maine's Allagash Wilderness. Their names were Chuck Rack, Charlie Foltz, and identical twin brothers Jack and Jim Weiner. Now they had all met studying at the Massachusetts College of Art. And this was supposed to be a relaxing 2-week trip filled with canoeing and fishing and, the fresh air and the wilderness. 4 guys in their early 20s doing exactly what you'd expect 4 guys in their 20s to be doing, on summer break. Now, on the night of August 26th, 1976, they decided to go night fishing on Eagle Lake. Before paddling out, they built a massive bonfire on the shore. It was a landmark so that they could find their way back to camp in the dark. Now, almost immediately after starting to fish, Chuck Rack spotted a large, bright sphere of colored light hovering motionless and soundless about 200 to 300 feet above the southeastern rim of the cove. So the men pointed a flashlight at it. And the object apparently responded, and it moved toward them. As they paddled as fast as they could to get back to shore, a hollow beam of light came from the object and engulfed the men in their canoe. And then there was nothing. The next thing that they knew, they were standing on the bank. The craft was gone, and their once blazing bonfire had been reduced to embers, indicating a significant amount of time had passed since the incident, even though to them it had felt like only minutes. Those big logs that they stacked up, hours of burn time, gone. So the men, after their trip, told their families, and of course their families didn't believe them. So they kind of just went back to their lives. And for 12 years, that was kind of the end of the story. Then in the late 1980s, Jim Weiner suffered a serious fall that left him with a temporal lobe epilepsy. And that's when things got kind of strange. Now, during treatment, Jim began to have nightmares about himself and his camping companions being nude in a strange place with bug-eyed humanoids around him. He also awoke at night to see strange creatures around his bed, sometimes feeling as though he was being levitated, and other times feeling paralyzed while something was done to his body. Now, his doctor that noticed that it was affecting his treatment pushed Jim to explain all this stuff. So Jim told him about the night on Eagle Lake, about, the missing time and what they had seen. Now, the doctor, who was somehow familiar with abduction research, advised him to contact a UFO investigator. So in 1988, Jim attended a lecture by UFO researcher Raymond Fowler and told him the whole story. Now, Fowler immediately recognized something crucial. This was a multi-witness case. So he proposed that all 4 men undergo hypnotic regression sessions separately with no contact with each other beforehand. So there would be no comparing notes, there was no coordinating stories, each man goes in alone. Now, each separately described in frightening detail being taken aboard the craft and subjected to physical examinations. Aliens taking samples of their skin and their body fluids. The beings were described as gray-skinned with large almond-shaped eyes, which is a description that aligns with classic gray alien encounters reported in other abduction cases. And I want to note that they were all very consistent on how they described these beings. Charlie described the interior of the ship like a doctor's office. Jack said that the aliens had terrifying faces but told him not to be afraid. The accounts matched each other in details that would be nearly impossible to fabricate independently. The bench they sat on, the lighting, the sequence of the, examinations. The final investigative report numbered over 700 pages across 10 volumes. It included background checks, medical records, diary analysis, psychological profiles, and 15 separate hypnosis sessions conducted over 14 months. So these weren't just, a bunch of guys on a podcast. I mean, this was a documented, cross-referenced investigation that produced more paper than most legal cases. But of course, this story has a twist. So in 2016, 40 years after the incident, Chuck Rack, one of the 4 men, gave an interview and said that the whole thing didn't happen. He said that the reason that he had supported the story at first was because he wanted to make money. He also dropped a significant detail. He said that the group had used recreational drugs on the night of the alleged abduction. And when he'd appear on the Joanne Rivers show and Joanne asked directly whether they'd been drinking or taking drugs, he was sitting far enough away that Jim Weiner had to field the question, and he watched Jim lie straight through his teeth. The other 3 men, Jim, Jack, and Charlie, pushed back hard on Rack's claims, calling his behavior increasingly unreliable, and pointing out that he had previously, tried to propose schemes to make millions of dollars off of the Allagash case before being cut out of the group entirely. Rack himself admitted that he did witness the strange lights on the lake. He just kind of disputed, or still disputes, I guess, what happened after that. So we have 4 young men who were in the Maine wilderness. All 4 of them see something in the sky. All 4 experience the missing time, the burned down bonfire. And then 12 years later, independently, under hypnosis, 3 of the 4 describe the same abduction in, pretty much perfectly matching detail. And then the 4th one comes out and says that it was all a money grab. And then the other 3 say that he's lying. Did 4 art students from Boston get pulled out of their canoe on Eagle Lake by extraterrestrials on a summer night in 1976? Who knows? Who knows? But, 4 people did see something. The fire did burn down after only a few minutes of their consciousness, And then for 12 years, none of them said a word. That's a weird thing to sit on for 12 years if, you kind of just made it up. It is kind of weird. But again, we don't really know. It is February 1959. You are a Soviet engineering student in your early 20s. You are experienced, you're physically fit, and you have spent years preparing for exactly this kind of expedition. You and 8 of your closest friends and classmates set off into the Ural Mountains of Russia for a 14-day ski trek. Now, you guys are good at this. You guys have done it before. You know exactly what you're doing. And then, you were just never seen alive again. And the official explanation, handed down by the Soviet government after a cursory investigation, is that you and your friends were killed by, and I am, quoting directly here, a compelling natural force. That's it. That's the whole explanation. A compelling natural force. Boom. Case is closed. The files are classified. Everybody, we can all just move along. 9 Soviet ski hikers died in the northern Ural Mountains on the night of February 1st into February 2nd, 1959, under undetermined circumstances. The group, led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, had established camp on the eastern slopes of Kholat-Syakhl Mountain, a name that in the local Mansi language translates to Dead Mountain. Now that's, the actual name of this place, Dead Mountain. Now, when rescue teams finally reached the campsite, they found that the tent was collapsed and it was covered in snow. Inside of the tent, the hikers' boots, clothes, and equipment were neatly arranged as if they were preparing to eat. The tent had been slashed open, but someone had made the cut from the inside. So these experienced mountaineers, in the middle of the night, in temperatures as low as 40 below zero, cut their way out of their own tent and ran, barefoot, in their underwear, into a Siberian blizzard. They ran about a mile downhill into a tree line, where they apparently tried to build a fire. And then they died, most of them from hypothermia. But the last 4, found months later buried under 13 feet of snow in a ravine, their deaths were something else entirely. Now, one girl was missing her tongue, her eyes, and a part of her face. One guy had crushed ribs and massive chest trauma, and another guy had a caved-in skull. And the Soviet medical examiner who examined the bodies stated that the force required to cause those internal injuries, and again, these were internal injuries that had no external wounds and no bruising on the skin, was comparable to a car crash. So there's no external wounds, there were crushed rib cages, all of this was from the inside. And then there's also radiation. Elevated levels of radiation were found on some of the victims' clothing in the Ural Mountains in 1959 with no obvious source. Now, the mainstream science community has spent decades working on this, and the most accepted explanation is a delayed slab avalanche. It's basically a small, specific type of avalanche that could have hit the tent silently in the night. And it could have caused serious injuries, and it could have sent the group fleeing in a panic before the extreme cold finished them off. I mean, it's a real, peer-reviewed, published theory, and it is plausible, and to be honest, it is probably the most likely explanation for the Dyatlov Pass incident. But it doesn't exactly explain everything. So the first thing that people point to is the orange spheres. Now, another group of hikers camping about 50 kilometers south of the incident reported seeing strange orange spheres in the sky to the north on the night the Dyatlov group died. Similar spheres were observed in the nearby town of Ivdel and surrounding areas continually during the period from February to March 1959 by various independent witnesses, including the Meteorology Service and the military. So multiple independent witnesses, a meteorology service, and the military all seeing the same orange lights in the sky on the same night over the exact location of the dead mountain. Now, Lev Ivanov, who was the lead investigator on the actual, Soviet case, concluded publicly that the party had been killed by an unknown compelling force. We already talked about that. Weird. But privately, he became convinced that they were killed by aliens. So the lead investigator, the official government man, privately believed that aliens did this. And then in 1999, Ivanov published an article admitting that his investigation team had no rational explanation for the incident. He also stated that after his team reported seeing flying spheres, he received direct orders from high-ranking regional officials to dismiss this claim, and his findings were immediately classified top secret. He was ordered to dismiss the flying spheres and to classify everything. So the alien theory says exactly what you'd expect it to say at this point. 9 experienced hikers were on a mountain in the middle of nowhere. Something came down out of the sky. Something encountered them, something that produced radiation and produced internal trauma without external wounds, and produced such absolute overwhelming terror that 9 trained, rational adults ran barefoot out of their tent into negative 40-degree temperatures rather than stay where they were. And then the Soviet government, which had every reason to cover up anything unusual happening in its territory during the Cold War, classified the files, they silenced the investigator, and they told the world that it was a compelling natural force, whatever that means. Now look, the avalanche theory is probably right. Most scientists think so. The injuries, as horrific as they sound, can be explained by the mechanics of being hit by a slab of compressed snow while sleeping. It hits with enormous force, it damages internally, it doesn't leave any external marks. And even like the missing soft tissue, like the missing tongue and stuff, as grim as it is consistent with months of exposure and, scavenging animals. The radiation is most likely explained by one of the hikers having, previously worked in nuclear cleanup or something like that. These are all real explanations. But a trained Soviet investigator was ordered to stop investigating. The files were classified for, 3 decades. 9 people fled their tent in their underwear at negative 40 degrees, which means whatever scared them out of their tent was more terrifying than dying of exposure in the dark. And what on Dead Mountain could have been more terrifying than that? Aliens. July 25th, 1976. NASA's Viking 1 spacecraft is orbiting Mars, and it's taking pictures of the surface looking for a safe landing spot for its sister probe. Scientists and engineers are going through hundreds of images of craters and rocks in plains. And then one of them looks at a photo and says, "Hey, that kind of looks like a face." A 2-kilometer-long Cydonian mesa, photographed on July 25th, 1976, had the appearance of a humanoid face. It was 2 kilometers long, staring straight up at the sky, on Mars. The Viking chief scientist took one look at it and called it a trick of light and shadows. NASA put out a press release anyway. On July 31st, 1976, a NASA press release said the formation resembles a human head. Now look, NASA was pretty clear from day one that this was an optical illusion. The sun was at a specific angle, the shadows fell just right, And the human brain, which is a face finding machine that will literally find a piece of, or will find a face in like a piece of toast or whatever, did exactly what it always does. It found a face on Mars. You know, that's what NASA said. It was just a trick. It was all an optical illusion. The case was closed. Except the case wasn't closed because the face wasn't alone. Now, in the same region of Mars, a place called Cydonia, sitting in the same set of Viking photographs were other things. Nearby were pyramid-like structures, and a man named Richard Hoagland didn't just see random hills and shadows. He saw the ruins of a vast city, with the face as a crumbling monument comparable to Egypt's Sphinx. Hoagland, who was a former science advisor to CBS News during the Apollo missions, spent years analyzing the Viking images, and in 1987 published a book called The Monuments of Mars, laying out his full theory. Now, Hoagland wasn't just saying that, hey, you know, this rock kind of looks like a face, oh, look how cool that is, everybody look at that. He was making a specific mathematical argument. His crown jewel was what he called the DNM Pyramid, named after its discoverers Vincent de Petro and Gregory Molinar, who were two computer engineers at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. The pyramid was a 5-sided structure that he claimed displayed impossibly precise geometry. And Hoagland argued that the angles between various features in Cydonia, you know, the face, the DNM pyramid, the so-called city, that they all encoded mathematical constants, which pi and the golden ratio. He and his colleagues argued that these structures were arranged in a pattern that incorporates specific mathematical constants, including pi, e, and the square root of 2. Now, it is true that, I mean, you can find mathematical constants in pretty much, you know, anything if you look hard enough and you pick your measurements carefully. I mean, that's fair, and that's what a lot of people say about this. But the thing about Cydonia that nobody really talks about is that two computer engineers at NASA's own Goddard Space Flight Center, which of course is de Petro and Molinar, discovered that the original face images had been misfiled in NASA's archives and almost lost entirely. Two NASA employees found a second image of the face that was taken 35 Viking orbits later at a completely different sun angle, and it still looked like a face. So from, you know, a different direction with different lighting, different sun angle, all of that stuff, it still showed a face. Then in 1998, NASA finally went back and photographed Cydonia and the Mars Global Surveyor at much higher resolution. And the official result? It was just a hill, a lumpy, eroded, perfectly natural Martian mesa that only looked like a face in the original blurry 1976 image because of the lighting. In 2001, they photographed it again, and it was still just a hill. The European Space Agency photographed it in 2006 and built a 3D model. It was still a hill, you know, definitely a hill. Mystery solved, said NASA. But Hoagland argued that some of the newer images may have been processed in ways that obscured artificial features. So he claimed that NASA didn't debunk the face theory, NASA just tampered with the photos to hide the face. Which is the kind of argument that is technically impossible to disprove, which is also the kind of argument that should make you suspicious of it. And yet there is one part of the whole story that I kind of keep coming back to. The Cydonia region sits on what many planetary scientists believe was once a coastline. Mars once had liquid water on its surface, and scientists believe an ocean once covered the northern hemisphere, where Cydonia sits. Which means that if you were an ancient civilization on Mars, you know, if one ever existed in the deep past, you know, before Mars lost its atmosphere and its water and became the frozen desert it is today, you might have built things along a coastline, just like civilizations on Earth do. And they built a face looking up at the sky, pointing at whoever might be looking down from above. But did an ancient Martian civilization build a monument complex in the Cydonian region, carve a 2-kilometer face into the surface of their dying planet, encode mathematical constants into the geometry as a message, and then just perish and, you know, leave their ruins waiting in the dust for another civilization to look down from orbit and notice it? You know, probably not. But it was NASA's employees who found the second photo. You know, it was the lead NASA scientist who called it a trick of light and shadow before the analysis was even done. The files also got misfiled in the archives, and the region was also once a coastline. But, you know, as NASA says, it's just a hill. As we all know, most UFO theories say basically the same thing. You know, aliens are out there, they're visiting us, they're probably more advanced than us, maybe they're friendly, maybe they're not. But at the end of the day, they're just beings from another planet. You know, that's what extraterrestrials are, that's what aliens are. They're just beings from a different world. You know, they're scientists and explorers, and they're these space travelers. And I mean, that's you know, we can all agree that's a pretty comfortable story. Well, the Collins elite looked at that and said, no. I mean, no. You've got it completely wrong. These aren't aliens. These are demons. The Collins elite theory says that there is, or I guess there was, a secret group buried inside the US government and military intelligence community whose conclusion, after years of investigation, was that the UFO phenomenon has nothing to do with extraterrestrials at all. They believe that, you know, our purported alien visitors are, in reality, deceptive demons and fallen angels, you know, minions of Satan, reaping and enslaving our very souls, and that they're paving, you know, the way for an Armageddon and for Judgment Day. Now, allegedly, this is the opinion of people inside of the United States Department of Defense. So I guess, you know, how did we even get here? You know, how does a group of government scientists and military officials end up concluding that we are in the middle of a literal biblical demon invasion? Well, it starts, of all places, with a rocket scientist. Now, his name was Jack Parsons, and Jack Parsons was genuinely one of the most important figures in the history of American aerospace. He was one of the principal founders of both the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the JPL, and Aerojet. He invented the first rocket engine to use a castable, composite rocket propellant and pioneered the advancement of both liquid fuel and solid fuel rockets. So this guy basically helped build the foundation for everything that eventually got us to space. He is also, and I cannot stress this enough, one of the most unhinged human beings who probably has ever lived. Jack Parsons was a devoted occultist and a disciple of Aleister Crowley, the man that the British press literally called the wickedest man in the world. And in January of 1946, Jack Parsons and his buddy L. Ron Hubbard, yeah, the guy who, you know, founded Scientology, performed a series of magic ceremonies from December 1945 to March 1946 known as the Babylon Working, which was essentially designed to manifest an individual incarnation of a Thelemic goddess named Babylon onto Earth. They did rituals in the Mojave Desert, and they believed that it worked. Now, Jack Parsons ended up dying in a mysterious explosion at his home lab in Pasadena in June of 1952. He was only, 37 years old. And then almost immediately after his death, something strange happened. According to the Collins Elite account, no more than a week after Parsons was killed, roughly 15 people who had been involved in the Parsons case were invited to attend a meeting at the Pentagon, where they received an offer to relocate to DC to conduct a study on whether flying discs had devil beginnings. So a government study on whether UFOs were demonic in origin, funded by your tax dollars. So yeah, it was a secret Pentagon demonology task force. Sure, why not? Now, the whole story was brought to wider attention by a journalist named Nick Redfern in his 2010 book called Final Events, which was based on interviews with alleged insiders. And I just want to note that none of those insiders could be fully verified. The key witness was a man named Ray Boucher, who was an Anglican priest and theologian who claimed that two Department of Defense physicists came to him in the early 1990s and told him about the whole entire thing. And in 2024, former Pentagon UFO investigator Luis Elizondo, who is a real named on-the-record official, said in an interview that he had encountered religious fundamentalists within the intelligence community. And he described a specific conversation where someone stopped him in the halls of the Pentagon and said, "Have you read your Bible lately? What we're dealing with are our demons. These are demonic beings, and we shouldn't be looking at them." So yeah, that was said in the halls of the Pentagon. A guy stopped him and said that to him. Kind of weird. Now look, there is zero verified documentation that the Collins Elite ever officially existed. You know, the sources are anonymous, the evidence is secondhand, and the whole thing could very easily just be, you know, Cold War paranoia wrapped up in, you know, fundamentalist Christianity and just handed to a journalist. But I mean, Jack Parsons, you know, the co-founder of JPL, one of the, you know, architects of the American space program, performed occult rituals in the California desert in 1946 to open a portal to another dimension. That part is true. You know, whether he opened the portal or not, or the dimension, I mean, we don't know if that's true, but he tried to. That's true. And then the very next year, 1947, was the year of Kenneth Arnold's famous flying saucer sighting. It was also the year of Roswell, and it was basically the year that the whole UFO phenomenon exploded into American consciousness. So, I mean, that could just be a crazy coincidence, or, I mean, you know, it could have been a rocket scientist who opened a portal to another dimension. And then after that, flying saucers started to show up. You know, it's a little weird, but yeah. And with that, those have been some of the darkest alien theories. Now, if you guys want me to make a part 2 to this video, please let me know down below, because I literally am sitting on like 90 theories that I could talk about, so I can make a bunch of these videos if this is something that interests you guys. But anyways, if you guys want to keep watching, I'll pop up some videos on screen so you can click around, watch different videos, you know. Also, be sure to subscribe if you guys are not already, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Have a great day. Peace out.